welcome to the Controller Talk podcast presented by Danfoss North America. Our goal is to bring you information about using Danfoss controls in the supermarket and warehouse industry, specifically in the US and Canada. We're doing these twice a month for now. You can catch these podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, and it's also available through the Danfoss Ref Tools app. For the video version, check us out on the Danfoss North America YouTube page. Search for Controller Talk to see our video collection. I'm Dave Yoder along with Chris Brown. So Chris, basketball season, who do you like going into March?
Maryland.
Wow, love that optimism.
I don't know. I mean,
it's anybody's guess.
Tennessee's, Florida's, I've seen them, watched a couple of their games recently.
Okay.
Florida's up and down, it seems like.
Okay. Is Auburn, do they have a chance to?
I haven't caught any of their games yet.
Okay.
So I don't know. Yeah, probably is the answer, but I just haven't seen it myself to know for sure.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, they've got a good record. They're like, what, 20-1 or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a couple Dukes looks like they'll probably end up being a 1 seed. And,
yeah, Duke's coming back.
But they're one, I think they might be the only ACC team that's ranked right now.
Wow.
Everybody else fell out. So.
Telling you.
Yeah.
It's anybody's guess right now.
SEC's the power conference right now, it looks like.
Okay.
I was on vacation last week, and I'm in the elevator, and everybody's got their sports gear on, and it was 2 SEC teams, and they were talking about how they're just going to run through the tournament, basically.
Oh, really?
I didn't want to point out how they couldn't run through the football.
You chose not to bring that up.
Yeah, they conveniently switched to basketball fans real quick. So I'm sure our Southern listeners are going to hate me now.
We have one in the north and one in the south.
Yeah.
All right. So, so today we're going to talk about Superheat. And to some extent, we want to talk about Superheat back at the rack.
Yeah. Because
we've had plenty of requests to track Superheat at the rack and be able to use that to figure out why their compressors have mounds of ice on them and why they're getting low superheat alarms and things like that. And so we want to talk about how to use the system manager or 255, whatever you've got there, to be able to kind of track that and use some options that are available.
Yep.
So yeah, I'll let you get into the setup on it, and then we'll talk about some calculations.
Yeah, it starts out pretty straightforward. If you're in the rack configuration section of the program, so yeah, depending on what model you're in, you might be going configuration, control, refrigeration, but that area, you'll be in the area where you're setting up how many compressors you have and those things, and You'll see some questions in there that are relevant to the superheat. So the first thing here is you have to have a temp sensor. So it is optional in your normal IO controlled racks whether or not you want to have a suction temp sensor. So you've got to say yes to that question first. Mm-hmm. Once you say yes to that, you'll see some additional questions that pop up. And one of them is, do you want to display the superheat on your status screen? Yep. And so there, obviously, you'd say yes so that you can display it. Now, at that point, it's not necessarily becoming a point you can log or monitor. It's just, do you want to display that superheat? Mm-hmm. But that'll at least give you some visibility to what the superheat is at any point in time when you're looking at the status screen for the rack. Yep. And then, in addition to that, if you then jump into your alarm section where you have your normal alarms for high and low suction pressures and things like that, now you'll see additional options where you can also set up high and low alarms based on what your superheat level is as well. And so that's the parts of it kind of under the canned rack setup that you'd be looking at relevant to the superheat. From there, the graphing of the superheat, so that would be, you'd have to do this through your normal graphing sections, and so you'll get into a little bit of what has to be set up to log it. But once we add the additional setups in place in some of the other areas of the program, then you'd be able to go in and graph it the same way you would under the normal history section for any of your other points in there as well.
Yep. Yeah, so the thing about the superheat on the rack is that you can see it, but you can't easily graph it. But there is a way around that, as there usually is. So to do that, what we would do is set up a calculation that looks at all the necessary information and then gives you basically a temperature output that is your superheat. And then from there, we can assign it in the controller, and then we can turn on history for it. So when it comes to setting up the calculation for the superheat, you'll go into a new calculation, and the first thing it asks you is the units. It always defaults to OI, but you're going to change it to SI degrees F.
Yep.
And we'll put a graphic up on the YouTube version of this that shows this. But after you change your units to SI degrees F, you can leave it as a generic calculation, give it a name if you want to, and then it's going to need to know a few things. Like, for instance, you'll have to put in a sensor based on the suction pressure. So that suction pressure transducer gets assigned in here. And then we also want to assign the suction temp sensor from the rack. And then when those two things are in there, the controller will allow you to put in what they call a refrig option as part of your calculation. And because it knows that there's enough information there that it can set that up. So the refrigerant option allows you to pick the refrigerant from the rack out of a list. And then I've noticed that there's also a option where you can pick either a temperature or a pressure, and you have to set it for pressure so that it knows that it's converting a pressure reading from that refrigerant.
Right.
And then the one of the last things you need to do in the calculation is you do some subtraction, and you subtract the the converted refrigerant temperature from the suction temp sensor to give you your superheat.
Yep.
And then, so yeah, you'll know it's right if the superheat reading on the calculation matches what you're seeing on the rack status, then you know you have it.
Yep.
And then there's, after that, there's two more steps, and then you're home free. The next thing is you would want to set up a miscellaneous sensor input. On the 255, it's pretty easy. You just tell you want one more. On the 800 and 800A, you have to go into control, tell it you want one more miscellaneous sensor input,
Yep.
and then take the calculation number that you just set up and assign that as that new miscellaneous sensor. And then you can give it a name in the miscellaneous sensor inputs, and then you make your way to configuration history and make sure you turn on history for that new sensor point.
Because the issue is we can't log calculations in history, so that's why we've got to assign it to the miscellaneous sensor to be able to do it. Yeah. So so for your normal racks, I'll call them, your HFC racks, where you're controlling it all through I/O and the system manager. This is all what we need. As we're getting more into the CO2 side of things here with the stores in our areas, the other thing to maybe point out is with pack controllers with us. A lot of your transcritical CO2 racks that you're going to see with Danfoss are going to have a pack controller on them. You don't have to worry about all of this with the pack controllers. So the pack controllers are already kind of to set up. The temp sensor on the suction side is required for a pack controller. So it's really more so a matter of just making sure your history configuration for the pack controller is configured the right way, because the superheat option's already going to be there under that area. The temp sensor, pressure transducer, those things again are required in the setup. So it's a little more straightforward there of just turn on your superheat logging for the pack controller, and you should have what you need at that point.
Just get the history turned on, and that's about it.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right, Chris, so it's time for you to answer a question, and it should be a superheat question, don't you think?
I guess.
So,
I always hope it's a piece of information I gave right before.
well, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I promised you a softball, so hope you're ready for a big
Swing and miss.
one. Yeah. So what is, and this is almost kind of a bit of a judgment call, but what are the typical superheat settings if you're setting up a case controller? What are the typical superheat settings for an HFC store and a CO2 store that you normally would see?
HFC side, I've seen any. So you've got two settings, min and max, because we work within a range. I've seen 5 to 10, 8 to 10, somewhere in there on the HFC side, and then they kind of historically played it a little safer on the CO2 side and went 10 and 15. People are starting to challenge out a little bit more and push it lower, and we're also starting to get into the liquid ejectors some, where you can flood your evaporators a little bit, but kind of broad answers, 5 to 10 maybe on the HFC side and 10 to 15 on the CO2 side.
So those are at least starting points anyway.
Yeah.
And then the customer may decide to change those.
Just from there, yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately, they set the spec anyway, for the most part.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, see, that wasn't so bad, was it?
Felt like an open-ended one I couldn't get wrong, I couldn't get right.
I think you're probably correct about that. Yeah. All right. So, no new listener mail here just lately. I'm sure that there's some around the corner. But if you'd like to drop us an email with a suggestion, or you have a question or comment, you can always email us at controllertalknorthamerica@danfoss.com. Thanks for listening. Our audio, video, everything engineer, once again, is still Maria. Still keeping those SD cards from filling up and making this all happen. Until next time, for Chris Brown, I'm Dave Yoder. Stay cool.